All right, macro students, this is our last video covering the last topics for macroeconomics for the year. So this video is going to discuss long-run economic growth and public policy designed to promote economic growth. So this will cover our last two topics for Unit 5, and since Unit 6 isn't being addressed on the AP exam, this is going to be it. So I mentioned a while back in Unit 3 when I first introduced the long-run aggregate supply curve. We talked about what shifted short-run supply, aggregate demand. We've spent a lot of time on that. But I mentioned at the time that we're not going to talk about what shifts long-run supply until later on in the unit, and that time is now. And the reason I bring up the PPF that you see on the left, that should look familiar way back in Unit 1, is because this frontier for the production possibilities curve is the same as your long-run aggregate supply. Remember, long-run aggregate supply represents full employment. It represents what your economy is capable of, the goal for your economy. You want to be at full employment. Sometimes economies get ahead in the short run, sometimes they're behind in the short run. But the long-run aggregate supply curve is your goal. The same holds true if you wanted to look at that from the perspective of a PPF. The frontier illustrates what your economy is capable of. Again, it's your goal. It's the same as the long-run aggregate supply. So if you were operating at points A, B, or C, you're being considered efficient. You're at full employment. So keep in mind that on a AP FRQ, the AP could pull up a PPF and connect it to long-run aggregate supply, and you got to be able to make that connection. So again, if you're operating on points A, B, or C in the PPF, that represents full employment or the natural rate of unemployment. Take a minute and try and pick out a point that would represent inefficiency or a recession. So a point that would represent inefficiency or a recession would be point D or E, because that's inside the production possibility frontier. And if you wanted to put it into numbers, this is a very simplistic representation of an economy. If you're operating at point B, it means you're maximizing production of pizzas and sugar. But if you're operating at point D, that means you're not producing nearly as much pizza that you're capable of and sugar that you're capable of. The same thing with point E. You're not producing as much given your combination of resources, your land, labor, and capital, which we'll get into in a second. And lastly, see if you could identify a point that's not yet possible, and that's point F. Point F is right there, and I know these are all captioned right here too, but it's good to understand where an efficiency is. It's at point D and E. A, B, and C represent long-run goals in full employment, and then point F is not yet attainable. So now in the upcoming slides, we're going to talk about how we get to point F, how we shift that production possibilities frontier outward, how we shift this long-run aggregate supply to the right, how we increase it. And so if you were to ask an economist, you can increase it in the following ways. And to sum this all up, think about land, labor, and capital. And within capital, you have human and physical capital. More on physical capital in a second. But with human capital basically refers to the skills and talents people have or people learn over their lifetime. So if any of those increases, your land, your labor, or your capital, then that long-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. Your PPF will shift outward. If any of them decreases, let's say that population decreases, you have less babies being born, you have a big out-migration, people leaving the country, your education system takes a hit. All of a sudden it's corrupt and it's run inefficiently. There isn't as much tax credits provided for investing in capital and new machinery. If any of those things were to happen, that's detrimental. That's a negative. That's going to impact your long-run growth. So then long-run supply would shift to the left. So again, to summarize so far, anytime land, labor, or capital increase, Your PPF, or long run aggregate supply, increases as well. When any of those decreases, for whatever the reason, that's going to be a leftward shift, an inward shift. Okay. You need to understand the term of per capita. When they talk about like real GDP per capita, real GDP per capita is the average amount of goods and services a person in your economy produces. So when it mentions per capita, what that means is just per person. And there's a positive connection between the amount of money people make and the amount of goods and services people make and their education levels. So as education levels rise in a country, people become more productive. Think about it. Think about how America's gross domestic product has grown extensively since World War II. And that's connected with the average years spent in school. Around World War II, people had mostly a high school, maybe a 10th grade education. But with the emphasis on education and completing high school and now finishing college, now people are more skilled to produce the high-tech equipment that we make today. So there's a definite connection that exists between America's growing GDP and America's growing emphasis on education. And it's not just the United States. If you look at any developed country in the world, one of the main reasons why that country is developed is because of the emphasis on increasing human capital, the skills we have through education and training, talent development. We're going to make a connection here to the other type of capital. So if you were a farmer and you have two choices, you can use the equipment on the left, that tractor that you see there, or the animal plow that the farmer is using on the right. Which one would you choose? Well, obviously you choose the tractor, right? You're going to be able to get more done. You're going to be able to plow more fields. You'll be able to plant more and harvest more agricultural crops. And why would you choose that? Well, because the tractor is a good example of physical capital. So when you think about physical capital, what comes to mind? So what comes to mind should be the computer software, the automated equipment, machines, and technology used to produce a good or service. All right? So when you think about physical capital, again, robots, software, automated equipment, technology, conveyor belts. Think of anything within a factory or manufacturing system that companies use to produce a product. And it doesn't have to be just factories. Think about with schools, with the emphasis on e-learning, computers, internet, Wi-Fi, things like that. That's all an example of physical capital. The more physical capital an economy has, the more productive an economy is going to become. And so when there are increases in physical or human capital or both, let's say let's say in a country, the average education level increases from a 10th grade education to a 12th grade education. All of a sudden, people are more skilled. They have more talents. Let's say at the same time, there's been a bigger emphasis on developing computer software to produce and automated equipment to make it easier to produce those things. That's going to lead to higher levels of productivity. And now economists believe that as an economy becomes more productive, a business or businesses are going to supply more. So as people become more productive, think about the components of supply. As workers become more productive, supply increases. It's a rightward shift. And look what happens to prices. As businesses supply more due to higher levels of productivity, prices fall. You have more supply, you're willing to cut prices because people are producing more. There's more capital, which leads to increase in GDP, Y1 to Y2, lower price levels, and therefore, remember, anytime price levels are falling, real wages are rising. So to summarize, anytime the government becomes involved here, and the government provides tax credits to businesses that give out training to employees. Like look at Amazon recently. Last year, Amazon offered this massive training program for all their employees to learn more about how to become familiar with computers, use computer software. That's a great example of Amazon investing in human capital. They're getting their workers more skilled and more developed. Government will step in a lot of cases, and they will offer tax credits to a company like Amazon. Like, hey, you pay for your workers to go back to school, you pay for your workers to go to college and finish degrees. Guess what? We're going to charge you less in taxes, or we're going to give you some money back at the end of the year for doing that, because the government realizes that this is a viable trade-off. Even though the government is giving money out from their coffers, they understand that people are going to become more productive thanks to this training, and therefore, as people become more productive, they're contributing more to their society, to the economy, which makes government better and makes the standard of living better for everybody. So you got to understand the role of government here too. Government plays a big role, and here's a couple good examples. If you follow politics, one of the things you always hear on the campaign trail is stuff like, oh boy, man, I had a great lead in. Well, let me do this one. Is stuff like, oh my goodness, it's stuff like this. Bernie Sanders unveils plan to overhaul public education. If I were to go to this one, and maybe I can bring the headline up here. Joe Biden debuts education plan, then touts it to teachers. You might ask yourself, why are they so concerned about education? Because politicians understand too that education is the way of the future. By making an economy and a group of workers more skilled and talented, it's not only leading to the betterment of life for that worker, it's leading to the betterment of life for all involved, because that worker is going to be more productive, and is going to produce more, and is going to contribute to a higher standard of living. That's why you always hear politicians talk about their plans to enhance education. And that hopefully sums up the role of government here. So in conclusion, guys, you need to understand the role of land, labor, and capital as it pertains to these two. An increase in land, labor, or capital, human or physical, is going to lead to an increase in your PPF and your long-run aggregate supply. Government can play a role here too by trying to encourage population growth, encourage buying more land, encourage investment in capital. And then you need to know the connection. As an economy becomes more skilled or more productive, what's the effect on wages, on productivity, on supply, on price levels? So in the AP Classroom question set that I created today, it'll have 10 multiple choice questions that you could see in an FRQ format on that FRQ in a few weeks. So try those out. Feel free to use these notes and email me with any questions. Have a good rest of the day.